it's Kira from Super Kids Speech. Welcome to another episode of Q&A with Super Kids. All right, today we're going to talk about elementary students, and if you feel that your child is having issues in elementary school, what can you do? So our question today comes from a mom in Essex County. She writes, "Dear Super Kids, my daughter is in first grade in our local elementary school. She seems to be a good student. She gets good grades. However, her teacher does report that she does have a hard time focusing sometimes. She could be silly and talk a lot. She demonstrates some impulsivity, and sometimes she gets in trouble for that. I am afraid that these things are going to affect her learning. How can I get her some support?" Okay, so this is a great question, because sometimes when we have children that are not obviously having enormous difficulties, right? They're not obviously having, trouble with their oral language skills, or big issues with their finer gross motor skills, or when they get to elementary school that they're really not moving forward in pre-literacy and literacy. So sometimes that can be a difficult area to navigate, that kind of gray area. So I'll explain the support that a public school can give, and there are two documents that can be drafted after a certain evaluation process. Of course, you're going to involve your child's teacher in all of this, and so, it takes a while to go through this process. But essentially, in the end, if your child does require support in school, they can have one of two legal documents drafted that will allow for them to get supports in school. One is called an IEP, which is an individualized educational plan. And in order to qualify for an IEP, your child has to go through an evaluation process and have learning deficits. So their deficits have to be below a certain number criteria, and in order to qualify. So they have to have academic deficits, in literacy, in math, in their overall cognition and IQ, in order to qualify for an IEP. And so, sometimes that process can take a long time, but you are protected legally by a timeline and certain things that the school district needs to do in order to move through that process. Now, if your child is not having academic deficits, or if they get evaluated and they say they are not deficient enough to qualify for an IEP, there is a second option. It's called a 504 plan. Again, I want a disclaimer. I'm talking about New Jersey. I know every state has, different ways of doing things, different processes, but usually there is an IEP and 504 in every state. But I'm specifically from New Jersey. So the 504 plan is a legal document as well that supports your child. However, they do not need to meet certain academic criteria in order to qualify for a 504. However, it is much harder to get a 504 plan in place. So essentially what you're saying, so like this mom was asking, is that she's saying, my child doesn't really have any real academic deficits yet, but I'm afraid that because she's having these issues with paying attention and focusing and impulsivity, and seems to be, getting in trouble sometimes for that, and if you notice those things at home too, then those things might actually affect academics later on. So in order to avoid having those issues and to get your child the support that they need, so they're not constantly getting in trouble, and they're not constantly, having to perhaps deal with and understand things that they might not be able to. Maybe neurologically there's something going on. And so you could ask for a 504 plan. However, like I said before, a 504 plan is really difficult to get. So that process could take a really long time. But the one caveat is that if your child has a medical diagnosis, it is much easier to get them support in school. So let's say this child, for instance, is not having any academic issues, but is having those underlying either executive function or overall skills, having difficulty with the skills that are necessary as foundations for learning, then there could be a neurological issue going on. So perhaps looking into going to a neurodevelopmental pediatrician and maybe ruling out something like ADHD, or some type of condition like that, then that could be of assistance. Because if a child has a medical diagnosis on the books, then usually it's much easier to get them support in school. So for instance, if this child went to a neurodevelopmental pediatrician and she was evaluated, they usually do an evaluation over several sessions, and she did receive a diagnosis of, let's say, ADHD, which does not necessarily mean that she's going to have any cognitive deficits. People with ADHD can have cognitive deficits and learning problems, but they may not. The same thing with people with diagnosed with autism. Sometimes people with autism, because autism is mostly a deficit in social functioning and social communication. There's other issues as well. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to have learning and cognition issues. So if your child has one of these diagnoses, they can not have learning issues, but still get the support at school through a 504 plan. So they could technically still get accommodations and modifications, such as, preferential seating, maybe counseling with a guidance counselor, maybe more time on tests. Even certain therapies could be covered under the 504 plan. So it's really important to understand what your rights are and what you can do to support your child in school. If your child is not in elementary yet, but going into elementary school, so let's say they're moving from pre-K to kindergarten, and you're seeing some of these problems, sometimes I've had families come to me and say, I know my child has an issue, that's why they're coming to see me as a speech therapist, but they went to the school district, they got evaluated, and they're not accepting them into the special education plan. So usually I tell those families, let's see if there's any issue. I will have a conversation with them, because as long as it's warranted, I would have a conversation with their pediatrician, and then a specialist, a neurologist, neurodevelopmental pediatrician that specialized in childhood development and any neurological issues that could be happening. So that might be something you want to consider before your child goes into kindergarten, because if your child does have a diagnosis, then getting them the assistance when you go to kindergarten would be much easier. So if they didn't qualify for the IEP, the special education services, and you did get them a diagnosis, they will qualify excuse me, for a 504 plan. So it's kind of tricky, it's a little bit confusing, but I just want you to know that you have options. And the earlier you do this, the more that you know, and the faster that you can get your child assistance, the better it's going to be for them in the long run. So Mom in Essex County, I hope that helps you answer your questions, and it probably gave you more questions, but you can also go to your local school district and ask them about a 504 plan. Look up your state's rules for what a 504 plan is and what the criteria is for getting your child support through one of those documents. All right, I hope that gives you some good information to go with, and I'll see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.